Yesterday, several of my Democratic colleagues spoke in opposition to the nomination of John Bush to serve on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. They were particularly concerned about his activities outside the courtroom, especially his personal blog posts. The comments of my friend, the junior senator from Minnesota, were representative of their concern. He reminded us that he's been serving on the Judiciary Committee for 8 years. He said that by confirming someone to the federal bench like Mr. Bush, who has blogged about controversial political and policy matters, the Senate would be doing something unprecedented. Specifically, my friend from Minnesota in angst said, "I don't think we've been here before. I don't think we've been here before," he said. Well, I'd encourage my friend to think a little harder about his tenure on the Judiciary Committee. Just a few years ago, the Senate considered President Obama's nomination of Stephen Boo to be a federal judge in Missouri. Mr. Boo had been quite an active blogger himself. His blogging and online commentary were not simply confined to political satire and sarcasm. His blogging didn't use merely flippant or intemperate language. His blogging demonstrated a real and palpable animus toward conservatives and Republicans in general, and to elected Republicans in particular, and by name. By name. He insulted and impugned people like his home state senators, his governor, the President of the United States, and a Republican nominee for president, just to name a few. Mr. Boo's posts were truly mean-spirited. It wasn't just that he called Republicans knuckleheads, which he did. That was when he was feeling especially kind. No. He said specific Republicans were, quote, corrupt. They had done evil things, Mr. President. I can go on and on about his corrosive rhetoric. He approvingly posted an article describing how San Francisco was contemplating naming a sewage plant after President Bush as a suitable legacy for the president, and posted another one that said his governor was highly ignorant. His invective was not reserved to members of the political branches. He said his state Supreme Court was the most corrupt in the history of the state. I'm not making this up. And he's an officer of the court calling the Supreme Court the most corrupt in the history of his state. Now, for my Democratic colleagues who now profess to care about the judgment of judicial nominees who blog, I submit that impugning the integrity of the tribunal that has jurisdiction over their professional conduct and law license, as Mr. Boo did, is more than a few tweaks shy of exhibiting sound judgment. More than a few tweaks shy of exhibiting sound judgment. Mr. Boo also implied that President Bush made his Supreme Court appointments as some sort of quid pro quo. He harshly criticized numerous sitting Supreme Court justices by name. And he claimed that Republican nominee for president only wanted federal judges who would disregard the law and rule in favor of the religious right, and that he was sucking up. And he made a crude comment about women that I will not repeat. Now, some of our Democratic colleagues have criticized John Bush because he said he would try hard to be impartial as a judge. By contrast, in one of his blog posts, Stephen Boo flat out said that he himself should not be a judge. This is his commentary on himself. But every one of our Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee at the time, including our friend from Minnesota, obviously disagreed with his own judgment about himself. They all voted for him. which is especially curious in hindsight, given the superior weight our Democratic colleagues now place on blog posts. Only one member of the Democratic conference voted against Mr. Boo. These are many of the same Democrats, of course, who are supposedly aghast at the Bush nomination. Mr. Boo is now federal district court judge Stephen Boo. Finally, I'd like to set the record straight on the subject of the slur. Mr. Bush did not use the slur in a blog post, and he did not use it flippantly. In fact, he said he has never used this term and would never use it. Rather, Mr. Bush quoted by name someone else, a prominent author who had used the slur. And Mr. Bush quoted him to show how various authors had viewed our hometown of Louisville over time, both those who praised it and those who criticized it. In short, Mr. Bush said he used it to show the good, the bad, and the ugly. So who was the author he quoted? Verbatim and by name. Why, it was noted liberal Hunter Thompson. I note that Mr. Thompson's use of the slur did not prevent liberals, including Democratic office holders, from praising him. In fact, not one, but two Democratic presidential candidates went to his funeral, George McGovern and John Kerry. Now, Mr. President, the Senate has considered a judicial nominee who did use this slur in blog posting, who actually did it. The exact same slur, in fact. The judicial nominee was not quoting any literary or published work. And this judicial nominee did not use the slur for any critical purpose. The judicial nominee used it flippantly and cavalierly. Who was the judicial nominee? President Obama's judicial nominee and current federal district court judge, Stephen Boo, who sits on the bench right now for life after being confirmed by the votes of our Democratic colleagues. So I hope I've at least refreshed the memory of my friend from Minnesota and some of my other Democratic colleagues.